So the bill is not likely to come to the floor, but you know what? It's almost irrelevant. If we pass the bill tomorrow on the House floor, it would still have to go to the Senate. If it would happen to be passed in the Senate, then it would go to the President. If it happened not to veto it, then it became law, it still would not automatically get done what we need done. Because there would be court cases. It would go to the Supreme Court. And there's been so many rare times in our history where the Supreme Court has ever protected the people against the government, especially dealing with monetary affairs. Whether it was gold clause contracts, whether the government had to pay in gold or private companies had to pay in gold. And the government always took the position that contracts had to be violated. You know, there is a provision in the Constitution that says the government's supposed to enforce contracts, but we have the thing all turned upside down. They destroyed the contractual arrangement. They, in the 1792 Coinage Act, said that counterfeiting was evil. If you committed counterfeiting, you could get the death penalty for that. But lo and behold, today, we allow our government to counterfeit endlessly. I wonder what the Fed, maybe that's why the Fed doesn't like me too well. Maybe they think I know about the 1792 Coinage Act, but if they're going to be accused of counterfeiting. But it is counterfeiting. It's an immoral act. It's a horrible thing to have a central bank ruining the economy, creating bubbles and busts and depressions and inflations and all the problems, financing wars and financing welfare, always undermining your personal liberty, always destroying some of the good parts or the good parts of America where liberty was to be protected and why we were the freest and the most prosperous country in the world. Today, we still have a lot of prosperity on the surface, and we have a lot of military power, but believe me, it's not for real. It's all based on debt. Today, our country has to be poor. The people have to get poorer. We spend, if you take all the weaponry of the world, we manufacture 70% of all the world's weaponry. And everybody is told we're scared to death. Scare the people. We have to go over and bomb Iran because they might someday get a weapon and they might come and someday might bomb us. But it's on and on. And of course, war is a pretty big issue. I mean, Obama has changed the definition of war. He doesn't call it war anymore. He calls it overseas contingency operations. Sounds like 1984. It's sort of like what torture is, enhanced interrogation technique. So we have a president that won because he sounded more peaceful than the other candidate. Just like George Bush sounded more peaceful-oriented in the year 2000. He didn't like the other administration because they were nation-building and policing the world, and he was opposed to that. So the candidate for peace was elected. So what has the candidate for peace been doing? Well, the first thing he did was he said he was going to wind the war down in Iraq. Well, he only had 9 months, but there's a couple troops that came home, and they were replaced by private contractors. And the private contractors make twice or 3 times as much as our military personnel. It's costing us more money, and the danger is still there, and the time bomb is still there. So what are we doing in Afghanistan? Arguing over whether we should add 30,000 or 40,000 or 60,000. So that war is being expanded. At the same time, the war into Pakistan, the front lines is moving over into Pakistan. They say, well, the bad guys have moved out because now we occupy Afghanistan. So they're moving over into Pakistan. So it looks like we have to continue the bombing in Pakistan. Then we wonder why they get upset with us when we send drones over, we bomb people, and civilians get killed. And then they wonder, why should they be upset with us? What would we think if they came in? What if China did that to us? And what if they had a base on our country? We would be so outraged, and yet the American people just let it go by and let it happen. And it's bankrupting us. No, and on top of this, plans are being laid for the day that we drop bombs on Iran. Sanctions are going to be increased. It's a country that can barely they can't even manufacture enough gasoline for their own automobiles, and they have never violated a UN. They've never been sanctioned by the UN as far as its weaponry go. Their doors are open for inspection, and the war drums are beating. And the American people have to realize that we don't need another war. What we need is common sense. We need to obey the Constitution and to recognize that we should never go to war unless there's a declaration of war. So we have a president that hasn't quite lived up to the peace agreements or peace proposals that he had already made. So what happens? He gets the Nobel Prize for Peace. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. But it may make sense to the internationalists who would like to pursue world government, and he's much more internationalistic in doing this. But the significance of all this, because he campaigned on events, he wins the Peace Prize, and actually, those individuals in this country made up of liberals, progressives, conservatives, constitutionalists, and libertarians, and it was a significant number of people, especially before we went into Iraq. It's been totally neutralized. There is essentially a very, very weak anti-war position. But you know, I still don't worry too much about that for the long term. Short term, I do. But the long term, it's all going to end. And it's not because I'm going to give a grand speech on the House floor and they're going to listen to me. That's not going to happen. But the reason it's going to end is because of some of the things that you have talked about here in your concerns about your finances. And you're concerned about what's going to happen to the dollar and where the deficit is going to go and what's happening to the gold price. And that is that it was announced in 1971 that we no longer could honor our commitment, and it was a technical admission of bankruptcy, although we've been continuing for a long time. But now we are going to have the real bankruptcy, and that will be the destruction of the dollar or tremendous decrease in the value of the dollar, and believe me, it will bring us to our knees. We will not be able to afford this, and we will have to come home. We did not have to fight the Soviets. The Soviets were defeated by their own fallacies, just as Mises said. Mises early on in the 20th century wrote that socialism can't work, they have no pricing structure, and it will fail. And it has not worked, and our system can't work either, because it might not be as militaristic as, say, fascism and communism, but it is very militaristic, and it's growing, and it's based on all the spending. So when the crisis comes, our troops will come home. The empire will end, and you and I, and especially our children, especially those college kids we're talking to, they will have to decide what kind of a government we want and what kind of government we should have. Should we have the government we have today, or are we going to offer something else? And I say, let's offer something else. There's something a lot better than what we have today. The empire would come to an end, but there will also, I believe, under those conditions, there will be a thing called de facto secession. There will just be no credibility in Washington. The checks will be bouncing, and people won't have jobs except the ones they do on their own. And there will be no way. They will try. There will be a ruthless effort to hold the people in check and find out every single thing you do. And every single administration in the last 30 years, and this one especially, accumulating more information and more control over every single activity that you pursue, whether it's medical or financial. Every time they pass a bill that says it's supposed to be like HIPP is supposed to protect your medical privacy, it did exactly the opposite. And now the medical care system is a typical example of how they want to scare you and push you into government. Scare you to death about H1N1, and therefore the government is going to take care of you and get on a list. We don't need it, believe me.